Welcome back to the 7,000th episode of Closing Bell. We've now been in lockdown for what, 2 years?
Yeah, it feels like it.
Something like that. Yeah. So we are. Last time at the very end, Trey had like a throwaway comment of, "What do you think this is going to do to in the long run? How is this going to shape the long run dynamics of the food system in the U.S.?" And we kind of said not so smart things back and forth to a while, and then afterwards people said, "Man, I wish you guys would have talked more about that and also been smarter on that subject." So we decided to do both of those things, in that this time we're going to devote the first half of this series to what's going to happen in the long run. How is coronavirus, this pandemic, the economic response, going to shape the food system 3 years in the future, 5 years in the future? And the great news about that is we don't just have Trey and Alex arguing with each other. We brought in the big guns. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dawn Tilmany, who is the president. Tilmany? I have a hard time with words. She's the president-elect of our national association, which is the Agriculture and Applied Economics Association. So Dawn, thank you for joining. And I guess let me start off by saying, or asking, what are your thoughts on this 3 to 5 years down the road? Where are we? Where do we look? I know that's a hugely big picture question.
That is a big picture question.
I can be more specific if you want.
No. And I both have some just high level thoughts, and then I actually brought some slides just to talk about some things I was working on before COVID even decided to happen, because I have spent part of my career looking at how local foods particularly have kind of emerged as a parallel system to the broader global commodity system that has fed our country so well. And so at a point in time of disruption like this, where all along we said, well, having that redundancy in that parallel system maybe would come in handy, it's been an interesting time to reflect on that. So I think what we see happening for sure is that we as a country had not faced hunger significantly in a long time. And so I'll talk about how this might ripple across the country differently, but with the first time people are kind of paying attention to how they get food and where they get food from, I think at bare minimum, we're going to have food systems brought back into a far bigger set of discussions about being part of the infrastructure we want to make sure stays healthy and well in the U.S. I'm both an agricultural and food economist and a regional economist. So a lot of times when I tell stories, I tell them with maps and pictures and in a spatial manner. So one interesting thing I thought was put out by Brookings is they made a map looking at what regions of the country they expected to be most affected. This is way beyond food, although energy's in here too. And as we all know from the ethanol discussions, we kind of are in that space too. But what you see here is that actually this is where rural America, which is generally not thought of as having a competitive advantage, is actually faring better. And I think we've seen that just because we have an ability to socially distance way easier than average. And particularly, as you see, they pointed out here, some agricultural areas, because so many of the operations are conducted outside. Now, since this report's come out, there's been a lot more contentious about if that's going to hold true, just because with ag and food workers being essential workers. And again, I think this is going to raise the questions again about how we value our workforce that feeds this country. I think we're starting to see heightened attention. So go on to the next slide and talk a bit about that.
Can I ask just one question about
Sure.
that? That said, just because I don't totally understand that those little bubbles, I think it said something like share of metro employment in high risk industries. And I wonder just about the fact that there are no metro areas in all of those gray. So is that saying that those places aren't hurt, or are they just not in this story?
They're assuming they're not going to be hurt, but also you have to remember a lot of our ag production, particularly in California and Texas, does come out of what are considered metro areas. They're not what we would think of as metro areas, but there's almost no part of California anymore that's not a metro area. So I should have been more clear about that. Sorry. But in this map kind of shows the story a little bit more, and you can notice a surprising fact here about Michigan. This is actually something Farm Bureau put together, looking at how beyond farming, how dependent some of our rural areas are on food manufacturing, which is the next stage of the supply chain. I expected Michigan to pop out here as potential
manufacturing hub, you would think.
Dependencies, and it's not. It'd be interesting to hear you guys remark a bit about if you see any resurgence coming back there, because we, in fact, in Colorado have, beyond even our big meat packing plant, which I'll talk about in here in a little bit, have had a little bit of a resurgence there. Have you seen that in Michigan at all?
A resurgence in
food
manufacturing jobs?
Beverage manufacturing, besides beer. I know you're going to bring up beer, Trey. That's fine.
Always.
Some of that's in Colorado is beer, but a lot of it is other food products too. Have you guys seen that happen in your state?
Well, I think it's probably a base number difference. So like Michigan just has a lot of manufacturing jobs in general. So like if we looked at probably the total number of jobs, you would see probably more. But especially with kind of the classic like GM manufacturing plants that, I mean, my neighborhood was built specifically for that operation. You know, that doesn't mean that those jobs don't exist here. It just means that relative to the other manufacturing jobs, I would imagine that it's just a smaller share. Does that make sense?
Yep,
yeah.
Totally. So we'd seen this happening, and one I wanted to bring up because of what's going on right now is what's going on with animal slaughter. So what you see is two maps here. The one on the right-hand side is actually startups. So even though you think of concentration and that there's 4 to 5 big plants for all of the major meat products out there, at the same time, we've seen this parallel system of smaller and mid-sized plants stay in place, partly to support some of the differentiated specialized systems. So the darker the color of state is on that map on the right-hand side, the more we've seen startups originate there between 2007 and 2013. That's the latest I could get when I made these maps. On the left-hand side, it's the same thing, but in terms of employment and what we've seen from employment growth. Remember, this could be, just like Trey says, starting from a base of close to zero, which might be the case down in Arizona, New Mexico. But again, in this case, we did see that Michigan has even seen a fairly good clip of startups and employment growth. And again, this grounds kind of counter to this idea that of concentration, although as you see from the numbers, the big plants still so clearly dominate in the space that they're still really leading the charge on how our supply chain gets meat to produce to the consumers. But we're seeing a real resurgence again of smaller animal slaughter plants to serve some of those specialized markets. And kind of thank goodness they're there right now, because in some cases they're adding shifts, and that's why we aren't seeing at least quite as bad a bottlenecks in Colorado as we would otherwise, but they're still pretty bad.
So on that note, Don,
sure.
So I know Wyoming just passed some legislation as it relates to, I think, local meat processing. And it's, I guess I haven't been able to follow it super well, but do you see more states that are probably going to be moving in that direction towards kind of allowing for smaller slaughter operations, or?
Yes, and for a few reasons. We were already looking at state certified in this state too, and it was not getting anywhere. We right now allow people to slaughter up to tens of thousands of chickens at their facility without USDA inspection if they sell directly to the consumers. There's already been some of these wiggle room laws happening if people were having short enough supply chains, and by short supply chains, I mean there aren't that many changing of hands in a product getting from the farm gate or ranch gate to the consumer. If you haven't been paying attention, in addition to workers being lost at some of these plants now, we have actually USDA inspectors who are lost. So this is starting to be a public health concern for the regulators. So there's even talk about if FSIS, which is the regulatory agency overseeing this, would start almost having a kind of like how we're having to proctor our classes and give exams virtually. Could we even think about a way we could actually do virtual audits and inspections of plants, which would make it less cost prohibitive for plants to be inspected? Because really, if you don't understand how this works, you need to have a USDA inspector on site to be USDA certified. So that's like one whole salary that a plant has to cover that's completely for regulatory oversight for no productive capacity. Well, if
Sounds
you're
a whole lot more like Big
not-
Brother too, though, right? I mean,
What?
it sounds a lot like Big Brother too. If there's some all-seeing eye in my my facility.
I don't mind people being there watching over to make sure people are careful, but yeah, I think there's a balancing act there, and we might be balanced a little bit more towards it being a little, you know, and you know, one person overseeing 3 people seems excessive. One person overseeing 1,500 people a shift at JBS Swift is a very different thing, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's also, we just don't have a balance, and that's going to be scrutinized, I think. How about, well, so this is the map for everybody who's tracking this of where we're having incidents pop up around the country in the meat slaughter supply chain. I'm not meaning to pick on them. I just think it's very high profile, and the biggest one is in my state. So I have to kind of own the fact that that's happening, and it's been a huge stress point. We've brought the National Guard to help test employees as they go in, because that reopening is going to happen, because we can't afford to have that down. But we're going to talk about resiliency. I guess the big answer I come up with is resiliency is we may find, even if you weren't concerned about concentration in the sector because of the competitive aspects of it, now there might be a revisiting of it for the resiliency aspects of that. Because beyond these plants being shut down, if you're not tracking what's going on in transportation and cold storage shipping containers right now is almost as big of a bottleneck according to my producers. So I'll stop there because I've already rambled on quite a bit. I have a couple other things I could talk about, but this was my best way to kind of highlight what I thought was going to at least be the top of mind for policymakers coming out of this event.
Well, Don, let me ask you a question, because we've got a question on the Q&A feed. And just as a reminder, if you do have questions or comments, or we say something stupid, please throw it up on the Q&A so we can see it and either answer the question or apologize for being dumb. But Karen asks, many of the plants we've seen closing down are pork plants. Is it true that it's only pork plants, or why is it pork plants that are predominantly being shut down?
It isn't. There are more pork plants out there too, possibly shut down, but JBS over here in Colorado is a beef plant, and it's, I think, the biggest plant to be shut down, and it was beef. So I think there might still be more existing pork plants because they're part of an integrated supply chain with some of those partners like Smithfield. But I have not, it's a really good question though. I have not heard whether there's any sense that there's been more and less scrutiny of different animal products. That you know, that's an interesting thing to note, but it may even be something to do with how controllable you feel like the environment is. But again, we know beef is shut down mostly by the fact it's hurting Colorado as the worst of anybody right now. Does anyone else have a good answer on that?
Pork and beef are the ones that everybody's talking about. I mean, I haven't heard anything on poultry.
So Jason Lusk says total slaughter numbers are down more for beef than they are for pork in percentage terms. So maybe
I think 8%, right? I think we're at 8% or something. And there's it's probably going to be more visible and talked about in the beef space because so much of the chicken and pork space is so fully integrated with the companies who actually have the contracts for production, owning and controlling the movement of those animals up through the slaughter stage. Whereas in beef, we still have quite a few independent agents out there who are still doing this almost on a cash market basis. So it's probably at least going to feel more stressful in that space just because there are a lot of producers who don't have an automatic entry point into processing capacity if they hadn't set up long-term contracts. And those are, of the major meat products, that's the product that's the least fully contracted long-term. Seafood, I wish I had some exposure or information on. That's a space I don't play in, but I've also heard seafood has been significantly impacted, not just because restaurants are shut down and that's such a venue for them, but there's been, I think, a lot of uncertainty and concern about how their processing capacity can operate safely in this space as well.
And so Claudia Schmidt points out that poultry has a shorter production cycle. So they just cull their flock before it gets to slaughter.
So on the production length, on the production cycle length, Don, what are your feelings on kind of short to medium run pork and beef supply? Do you think that the headlines are overblown, or I mean, in speaking probabilities, you don't have to throw down in any direction.
No, I mean, well, this is where it's advantageous that restaurants are offline right now. Although, as Jason has pointed out in some of his work, and we're seeing the cuts people use for home are quite different than the cuts they use at restaurants. Although we're doing our best in our household and buying bacon weekly now, Jason, just because you've nudged us there. But I think the problem is beef can sit on feed for a little while longer. There's even calls to open up some of the public lands we have available. That's a big deal out here in the West, to make some land available so it's not costly to even keep some of those animals before slaughter. But we're hearing, as Claudia pointed out, with both chicken and pork, those cycles run much faster. Feeding those animals is going to get expensive and not economically viable. So that's where you start hearing words like euthanize being used, and that's going to catch the public eye very quickly, and there's going to be a call to arms. I don't even know what our capacity is in this country to actually bring back having butchers happen on site at some of these places. There has been so much flux and so many rules by the FDA and USDA at this point. I don't know how crucial or critical something would have to look before we'd start really flexing infrastructure and regulations and what we're going to allow people to do. I keep watching and learning from producers how they're going to innovate through this space. But again, what I'm hearing most recently this week is this has become almost a transportation and cold storage problem at this point, at least out here in Colorado, where it's cost prohibitive to even get the other pieces of that supply chain to get products either stored or in the right places at this point in time. But I'd love to hear if you're hearing that at all there in the Midwest as well.
Go for it, Trey.
I mean, to an extent, I think that the transportation side of things are obviously what's interesting if you're following ag Twitter is everybody's talking about this gap in prices, right? And I think the immediate response is to try to double down on some of the regulation around the processing capacity of these places. It's not clear that that's really the immediate solution to me. You pointed out the idea of opening up some public lands. I've seen some conversation about CRP, for example, being maybe one alternative. I wonder about the political will to do something like that. I'm inclined to believe that it might be there, but I don't know, because it's hard to really know how to take the pressure off this kind of tightly wound supply chain. One benefit that I think you have is that because you focused on kind of local food hubs, you've been paying attention to the supply chain side of agriculture for I think longer than most. Usually you have like an economist who's like a production economist and consumer marketing economist or whatever, but you've been kind of looking at this as like a hub, like food hubs, and I'm not sure that policy is really set up to think about supply chains that way. So I think that we're all kind of in uncharted territory, particularly when we think about how state, local, and federal policy interact with one another. So this is on the beer side. I was listening to a webinar this morning where it's not clear who can regulate what right now, who's allowed to create the flexibility and the regulations, because you have city governments that are passing distribution laws that don't necessarily gel with what the state and federal legislation says. And I would imagine, that's for beer. I would almost assume that that's the case for most supply chains right now.
Well, the other innovation I've been intrigued by is how many restaurants are acting like kind of grocery stores right now too. And I thought you had to have a merchant wholesaler license, at least in Colorado, to do that, but no one's squawking at all that we have. I've probably seen at least 20 restaurants that, in addition to being able to pick up curbside food, they're allowing them to sell basically groceries. And so and some of it's that wholesale meat, which, the grocery stores don't even know how to handle it because they don't have a back room where they have people breaking down carcasses anymore, like they did when I was young, at least. So, you have people who are willing to take home a whole box of beef because they have a freezer. And, again, I'm not hearing my state government at all say that's something they're going to even pay attention to. So
well, that's an easy way to end up in the news. You know, I mean, there have been some places that have clapped down on that from a permitting perspective. LA is one. I think it happened, I want to say in Ohio somewhere as well. And almost immediately that was national news, that there were these food supply chain issues and the bureaucrats were getting in the way. So I mean, yeah, it's still on the books, I think, but you know, trying to find somebody that's willing to enforce some of this legislation and regulation is the next step to all of this stuff that's just a complete gray area.
Well, we've always been curious about if there's ever going to be another attempt to make a food agency. There's been a lot of, you know, concern about USDA is kind of the mothership, but that we have different agencies across the government who play some kind of a role, and that there has been some confusion even in past smaller events about where the buck stops. So it will be interesting to see if this raises the conversation again about whether there needs to be a more integrated food agency or approach at the federal level after this, because I think there's going to be a lot of things rethought. But I also think the USDA is trying very hard to pivot very fast and move very quickly on many things right now, particularly in the food assistance space. They've been giving more waivers than I'd ever thought I'd see in my lifetime to let food assistance programs do things I thought were never allowed to be done. So I no longer say anything about what I think won't happen, because I'm just going to be made to look silly later. But I think we should watch what's going to be allowed and how it's reacted to as a pattern of what we might see get revisited for long-term change when this is over. The last thing I was just going to bring up, but we don't have to cover this, is work I'd been doing in this manufacturing space. Being in a place like Colorado that has a startup and entrepreneurial culture to it, we see a lot of this happening where before this event, we had actually seen some of the mature product lines really not doing well. If you look at the market capitalization of some of our biggest brands, they were really, really struggling up through the start of this year. This initial stocking up that people have done of their pantries have really helped some of those brands. We've even heard of things like Campbell Soup adding shifts to their plants. But before that, what we were actually seeing is actually a resurgence again of the middle class. We are seeing in quite a few categories out there this resurgence of regional brands or craft brands that sometimes initiated from just startups that even started in a farmer's market or someone going to artisan food shows in their state, but that gradually blew up, and yogurt was one category. You could see a lot of this happening. My conceptual model of that was the idea that there had been kind of a revisiting of whether physical and financial focus of our supply chains, which leads to very efficient, low price offerings, and which the majority of our customers still want, was being revisited by at least some set of households who wanted something that was a little more aligned with their cultural, social, or human preferences. And that some of those brands were doing much better in uncertain market conditions where we saw a new diet fad or nutritional fad coming online every year or two. If you go to the next slide, where we saw that happening first was, of course, in beer, but I wanted to show you that I'm sorry, these are so small, but for a few categories, including animal slaughter, which we saw mapped before, bread and bakery, snack foods, and breweries, what you see between the top slides in 1991 and more recent slides in 2012, when I could put this data together, is we still see very bimodal, where there's a few large companies hiring most of the workers out there, but you see those middle bars have kind of come up, particularly in employment, where all of a sudden we saw some mid-sized plants out there in all those categories, not just beer, but animal slaughter, bread, bakery, snack foods. You'd seen this resurgence. Again, that's actually good for right now, because even though I thought it was mostly consumer driven, now that we need the resiliency of having some backup capacity if in fact we have some big plants continue to struggle, it's probably going to make it a little easier for us to find alternative sources of products. What we don't know is, depending on how severe this economic event is, is whether consumers are going to back off their nudging of this dynamic by being willing to pay the premium prices that often come with those non-national brands because they just don't have the buying capacity to. But again, we also see a lot of new relationships being made out there because people are trying new producers, new products, because it's what they can find available. So that's where the big question mark is are we going to see the economic shock from this reverse what was a consumer-driven shock of people wanting more variety, more differentiation, and products that are customized to exactly what they want to eat. So with that, I'll listen to you guys a little bit, but I have to jump off for my next meeting. But I appreciate the chance to brainstorm with you guys a little bit, and I can't wait to see how you, the next generation of economists, start mapping out the solutions, because to think hard and hypothesize, and it's your job to go do the work.
Well, thanks
Don. So much for sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, Don has been a fantastic mentor for me for almost a decade now, so I really appreciate you stepping in. Before you have to go really quickly, and you can pick one of these 5 things, what direction do you think of these 5 things where we should be more focused on moving forward?
I think immediately it's going to be how we redefine the regulatory environment for food and agriculture, because so much of it has been flexed already, and it's just going to be scrutinized before it gets put back into normal order. But some of that is indirectly going to be driven by what consumers now have been paying attention to that perhaps they weren't paying attention to. We got so darn good at feeding this country so efficiently and almost invisibly. People just weren't paying attention. And I don't think literacy is going to go up to 100%, but there's a huge chunk of society that's paying attention to things they didn't pay attention to. That tends to have implications for the regulatory environment, particularly, including in their policy environment. So that's, I think, at least what we should keep our eyes on, and make sure that people pay very close attention to the unintended implications of regulation and policy changes that always sound really good at face value, but always have ripple effects we as economists need to point out, because they aren't obvious if you don't think geekily like we do. So again, another grand challenge to our field to make sure that those policy and regulatory discussions happen with some good analysis backing them up.
Great. Shameless plug. Don and I have a blog post that I put up yesterday on the MSU AFRI page. So read our post. Don's also on Twitter, and so Don is fairly new to Twitter, I think. So make sure you follow her. She's been very active, especially in kind of the current crisis. So very much worth a follow. Thank you for joining, Don. Really appreciate it.
Well, and I'll be back other weeks just to listen and not have to perform. This is a great dialogue, and it was good to see some friends on the chat feed. Sorry I have to go early, but it was great interacting with you guys, and keep these going. It's a great idea to end our weeks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, dude. So let's talk a little bit less abstractly about that question, the regulatory picture, and which dimensions I think we could see stuff increase or regulations get more stringent versus regulations get more lax. I think it's really interesting that her conversation about how there are these things as consumers we think we care about, and then all of a sudden something bad happens, and oh my gosh, it just kind of doubles down how bad that thing could be.
So I'm just going to warn you. As you might have seen my USA Today article. It was a little.
Oh, might I have?
I might have sent it to you a few times. So I just want to point out that I am drinking a mango habanero cider from Blake's Hard Cider right now, because I'm feeling pretty spicy. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot. So I believe that, like, the fact that we've been able to go to any grocery store in the United States, and while there might be some stock out issues a little bit, for over a month now, we've still been able to feed people in the middle of one of the most significant crises in I think the history of the food system in the United States. And that's pretty incredible. The fact, we might not have been paying attention, but the fact that we could live that world, not pay attention, and still have food on the shelves after a month is a pretty incredible feat. now, in terms of regulations, I think we're finding over and over again that people are willing to flex these regulations when things start coming down the pike.
Hold on though. My point was we need to be more explicit about which regulations we can imagine going which way. So I think you could see some getting more lax, and you could see equally some getting much more stringent. And so I guess think, you're going down the lax path. So let's talk that way first.
So if you think about like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, right? Like
so then let's go the other way.
Right. Okay. So but the point is, like, you know, he was trying to make a statement about communism, really, and it was, if you go read Maureen Ogle's book on meat, it's a fantastic history of meat book, but she talks about very heavily, at least a chapter long, on how Sinclair's book really only took off because Theodore Roosevelt was trying to come after the meat packers. And so it was promoted, and it was kind of interpreted into the general psyche as a statement or a treatise on worker conditions, even though the book itself really didn't talk that much about worker conditions and meat packing safety. So it makes me think that because of how much more salient the meat supply chain is on the processing side, we're probably going to see an increase in worker protection associated in the meat packing industry.
And I think that extends beyond the meat packing industry, right? So that's the one that's getting the big stories. The Smithfield is covered all around the world, and so we're going to see.
So the regulations are going to go up there.
Health and safety regulations, absolutely. Down. I think equally along the supply chain, when we think about the people that are right now being characterized as essential workers, even in the grocery stores, they're saying unprepared, and we're unprepared in terms of health protection equipment. I think that will increase the regulations in that dimension. The worker safety will increase.
So I on the worker safety piece, I do wonder about hazard pay. So I wonder if we're going to see some type of change in like the minimum wage legislation that exists, where somehow there's like some type of hazard pay that's built into the wage structure for businesses. You know, I think we've you and I have talked about this ad nauseum, that this essential, non-essential designation has really placed an emphasis on these kind of strange realities, like having migrant labor become an essential function, even though migrant labor are traditionally the jobs that domestic citizens are not terribly excited to do. So in those spaces, I think we're going to see additional wage regulation.
Wage regulation. You think that they're going to be raising things like minimum wages in these industries,
especially for the essential workers. That's my crystal ball.
So I disagree with you on that. You've seen that the Democrats are proposing some hazard pay to be added to some of the relief packages. Okay, we've got Frank Sherman says, can you differentiate between having food on shelves, accessibility, and people not being able to afford it during an economic crisis? Does our food system hold up when large swaths of the population cannot pay for food?
I mean, so full disclosure, Alex and I have been working with Felicia Wu for weeks now on a paper trying to disentangle this essential versus non-essential designation, and you know, we're trying to build this conceptual framework about how kind of future crises might be able to consider the trade-offs associated with public health benefits with these policies versus the economic consequences, given the institutional constraints. And the big push there is that, you know, the idea of identifying somebody as essential versus non-essential, you know, somebody's job is essential to them. Even if it's the comic book store, the guys that work at the comic book store, that job is essential for those folks. And so the idea that like somehow we can kind of identify segments of the supply chain that are not allowed or not able to afford the food that they purchase, you know, I mean, these are real consequences for real people that I think will ultimately affect the demand side of the equation. I mean, here in my neighborhood, just out my window, I went for a jog before I jumped on this call, and there was literally a bread line that was through the high school parking lot to the last stoplight. And so that clearly is going to have an effect on the demand side for food in the United States.
So one thing I want to talk about, which I think is just interesting, just because it relates to some of the stuff that you've been thinking about, that I've been thinking about before this pandemic changed our lives, was the issue of kind of urban-driven regulation of the food system. So things like animal welfare, which sound really nice at the time pre-pandemic, but then when you think about the shifting of these people's preferences towards, oh my gosh, I've lost my job, I have to afford, all of a sudden the food is a much bigger share of my budget. All of a sudden that animal welfare becomes less important, I guess, in my evaluation of these products.
At a minimum, in my economic brain, I'm thinking the price becomes more salient.
Well, but that's the point. That's the point.
I'm going to pay more attention to price now.
In that space, the animal welfare space, we've regulated ourselves, allowing price to driver. So things like the California battery cage regulations, Michigan animal welfare regulations, we've no longer allowed that price mechanism to be the thing that we choose between cage-free versus conventional eggs, for example. Now we've made that regulation, and we've become, in a lot of senses, I guess, in Frank Sherman's point here, less resilient in that sense. So I wonder, going forward, whether you or I anticipate a reevaluation of those types of urban versus rural conventional trade-offs.
So when I was at Oklahoma State, we ran this, or Jason really ran this study called the Food Demand Survey, where part of it was tracking food values over time. And so the whole point of the study was like, maybe people like there's an increase in concern about safety of food versus price of food, and so the entire, I think, 4-year period of time that study was running, taste was the most important food value. Now that was from 2014 to 18. If Jason's still on the call, he can correct me, but I would be I'm actually very sad that it's not continuing to run right now, because I do wonder if the food values, the relative food values of all these different things when we're trying to make our food choices, if those are shifting hard right now. And so actually, we're hoping to put together a weekly survey so we can start tracking those food values over time. Because, I mean, so this is hopefully a once in a century crisis, but having real-time data on how people are perceiving their food choices has, I think, unspeakable value in times where, I mean, we've seen the data. Transitions in the market are happening dramatically almost every day.
So let me ask you. So Karen's got a question related to that transition in the market and related to the regulation. So Dawn kind of pitched the idea and then left the call. She pitched the idea that because we've seen these food safety inspection people getting ill as a result of visiting all these places, the idea or the possibility of virtual meat inspection, that could really reduce the costs of production, and particularly for local small processors relative to those big processors. So Karen asks, do we think this shift to virtual, both in the short term, but I also hope we'll think about in the longer term, is a possibility?
I think it's definitely a possibility. I think we're all recognizing right now that there are so many things you can do remotely that even like 2 months ago you would have never thought to do remotely. It's a little unfortunate because we're all on Zoom meetings all the time now. But and there has been so there's been some really interesting data on student attendance and student perceptions of the Zoom classes versus the in-person classes. And the numbers, I'll have to pull them again, but it was about 90% of students believe that online classes are no substitute for in-person. So there are cases where obviously like the substitution is not going to work. But in terms of inspections, as we move towards kind of a more technological world, I mean, I think it's not a bad idea, from a safety perspective, but B, it might actually be a good thing, a net benefit for small businesses.
And so just my one point here is that not only is this a possibility, it's a reality if we look to other countries. So in Scotland, for example, last year or 2 years ago now, they put in, rather than inspections, they put in live video feeds in all these places.
Oh.
So you talk about the big brother, the all-seeing eye. That is ultimate kind of disclosure of what you're doing, but also in terms of, as long as you're complying, you are really reducing those costs.
I mean, we've put up all that phone tracking data. Your right to privacy doesn't exist already. It's just it's becoming more explicit.
You're gonna put on your aluminum hat while you're talking about that?
I'm sorry, but I mean.
Okay, so I'm changing the subject again to something back you said earlier,
okay.
Which was, you asked Jason Lusk whether you guys, or whether he would be willing or interested in putting the food demand survey back on. And maybe you'll be happy to know that he already beat you to it. Yeah, he and Glenn put on the beginning in January 2020. So
I did see that Glenn released his data this morning, and I meant to take a look at it. I think he has been tracking food values as well throughout this. So Glenn would be a good person to look into. For anybody that's on the call, Glenn Tonzer, awesome follow on Twitter. And he's been putting out a lot of this stuff on agmanager.info that's just publicly available, kind of running content on how food perceptions are changing right now. I just am selfish, and I wish I was a part of it.
Trey, what do you think we should do? Do you think we should keep just pontificating over the longer run stuff, or should we shift to the more immediate?
I think if we go quick, we ought to try to get through some of the data that we've put together, if that's okay.
And then we can shift back to this stuff if we have time.
Yeah, I think.
Let's do it, man.
So, okay, let me start driving. Okay, so what about now?
First, Owen Fleming says, how can we access the food demand survey data? Do you know, Trey?
So the old school stuff is on the Oklahoma State. Actually, Jason's got a blog post too. That's like the finale of the food demand survey. But then there's like Oklahoma State has, just Google Oklahoma State food demand survey, and I think Bailey just posted all the data. It's just up on the internet. Glenn's survey is again, you can reach it through Twitter. On Glenn Tonzer's Twitter account, which, like I said, he just posted content this morning. And then also, I think it's available at agmanager.info. But again, Glenn Tonzer's the point person for that.
Perfect.
Okay, so fast. So what about right now? So this morning, this happened. This was, or well, it was afternoon, I guess. So Widmer extended our stay-at-home order to May 15th, but we're starting to see loosening of restrictions on retailers, garden centers, etc. So this is promising. We're moving in the right direction in terms of.
So what's the right direction? What do you mean by that?
So our total number of cases are increasing at a decreasing rate. So we're starting to see the effectiveness of social distancing kind of take root, and so we're starting to evaluate some of these public policies one by one as we move toward a more open economy.
I'm just a little bit wary to say moving in the right direction, just because I'm not a public health official, so I don't know what the implications of opening these things back up. I get it that if the disease disappeared, they should go back online, but there are also big risks associated with that too.
Right. Moving in the right direction doesn't necessarily mean be Georgia right now. It just means kind of piecemeal, incrementally starting to think about what can and can't open while still preserving the public health. So that's fair. So for resources on kind of what this new executive order means, because it just happened a few hours before we jumped on the call, Michigan State University's Farm Management Group has agribusiness resources that are available. Schaefer's been a big part of that. And then also Farm Bureau has done a really good job of providing COVID-19 resources on their website. A lot of this stuff has been largely federal policy focused, but I think kind of as
the Michigan Farm Bureau stuff is more state level, or has more state level stuff, state level guidance than the Michigan State does.
Yeah. So go there if you need stuff. Also, crazy thing this week: oil prices just absolutely bananas. So I moved here from Oklahoma. Been thinking about oil prices for a long time. My grandpa was a wildcatter back in the day, and if you want to read an amazing book on oil, The Prize is probably the most famous one. It's also very long. If you want to read one that's more about kind of the weird oil crisis of the 80s, which might have some insights for you, there's a book called Funny Money that kind of walks you through. It was the Penn Square Bank crisis in the 80s. There was a very small bank that kind of over leveraged a much larger bank, and as energy prices dropped, which they do, you saw this whole sector of an economy just get wiped out in Oklahoma. Super interesting book. It's called Funny Money. That one's shorter. The Prize is really famous and really long. Funny Money is just more fun. Like they used to throw $100 bills off skyscrapers and shoot them with Colt revolvers in the 80s in Tulsa. So fun book.
That's strange.
Yeah, now you know.
I don't think you and I aren't oil economists, so no. Other than $100 being shot off of skyscrapers, probably we don't have much more to say than this is pretty crazy.
Fascinating. There's some great content out there, though. Andrew Jansen has posted some really good stuff, as has Dan Sheetram out of Arizona. I would recommend Dan's stuff. He's been following this a lot closer than we have. And he's also on Twitter. Very much worth a follow. Okay, so labor is still not great. So this is just an update. This is jobless claims per 100,000 of workforce since March 15th, as of April 23rd on the left. And so if you'll notice, Michigan has been kind of at the top of the list for job losses. So this is, I mean, it's sad to laugh at it because you kind of laugh just not to cry. This is not 100% normally distributed across all of Michigan. So there are hot spots. So this map on the right side is jobless claims across the state. So notice that there are still some places in Michigan that has under 15% of it for an April jobless rate as of the Bridge analysis. That's, again, our unemployment rate in the United States was like 4% not that long ago. Jobless to unemployment rate is not the same thing, but just keep in mind, there are certain places in Michigan right now that have a jobless rate over 30%.
Can we quickly talk about which places those are and what's driving that there? I don't know as much about Michigan as you do, so if you have thoughts or don't have thoughts, I'm just curious as to.
Well, I would imagine we've got a lot of listeners that are going to know more, but you'll notice that over in southeastern Michigan, that's where Detroit is. So one of the first things that I think people look at when they're trying to evaluate Michigan is they'll look at the Upper Peninsula and the Lower Peninsula. Obviously, the Upper Peninsula is much less affected. And then when you get to the Lower Peninsula, I think the first thing that people look at is Detroit versus Grand Rapids. And you can see the differences there between Detroit and Grand Rapids, the Grand Rapids being in the southwestern part of the state. Mm-hmm. Now, if we look in the northern part of the state, at the top of the mitten, I think you're starting to see the tourism industry is probably going to be a big hit. So service sector jobs up there are almost definitely impacted, considering that the stay-at-home order that was removed today actually banned travel to second homes, and here in Michigan, that's a really big deal to go north. So that's conjecture. This map was put out just this morning, so there's going to take more analysis to really get through this. But it is interesting to see the distribution, right? That like this isn't everybody's losing their jobs at the same rate.
Well, it just, yeah, you're right. It's worse in some places than others. But 15% is
still not great.
Pretty high, yeah.
Okay, so this matters a lot for farmers, more than people, I think, tend to realize. So here's an article from the Wall Street Journal from a couple years ago that talks about off-farm income. So this is kind of the source of farm household income in the United States up through the late 2010s. And if you'll notice, non-farm income for farms in general in the United States, according to USDA data, actually tend to make more money from their non-farm jobs. And so, just keep that in the back of your mind that, like, even though, agriculture in our heads is just like, a farmer earning his salt of the earth, earning his living off the land. Most farms rely at some level on off-farm income.
Hold on, but so does that mean that this is good for agriculture in terms of agriculture output, because now people dive into agriculture more as a larger share of their income? Or does that mean they say, screw this agriculture stuff, that was just my hobby, now I can't afford to have a hobby?
Well, there's a good way to lie with statistics. Saying any of this is good for agriculture is going to be hard to pull off.
You're right. So let me say that more clearly, that do we, in the medium to longer term, does that mean more agricultural production, or does that mean less agricultural production? See, I think it could go either way. I don't think we can be as certain about that. I think you can say, well, that I've lost that other source of income, now it's time to go full time on the farm.
I think this doesn't mean less agricultural production. I think prices mean less agricultural production. So because we've seen such a decline in prices, it's not clear to me that anybody's going to be wanting to plant extra acreage anytime soon. The Don already threw this up, same figure. Okay, so this gets to my prices point. So I stole this from Jason, who posted this morning. This is weekly changes in wholesale box beef prices. Just notice the volatility. The volatility, we've been talking about it literally for months now. This is why, if you go read anybody on the stock market right now, they're all saying, like, this is just nuts. Like, I don't know how to keep up with it. This is breaking me. Because the volatility, like, yeah, people like to show these nice clean figures of like some type of growth trends or anything else, but look at how far all over the place we are on this. So the gains are large, but so are the losses. And so it's not clear exactly, well, it's not clear that one day is going to tell you that much about the next day.
Let me. So we've got a question here from Ashley Davenport, and I want to ask it, and I want to follow up with the point about, does this mean more agriculture or less agriculture? So Ashley asks, do you think farms in the medium to longer term will become more diversified or less diversified as a result of this? And I think we can take that two ways: the off-farm income versus on-farm income, or the of stuff they produce on the farm. And then coming back to my point, I think you need to, agricultural prices are going down, which is bad for farming. But if you're talking about that off-farm to on-farm trade-off, you've got to think about the opportunity cost there, where the prices are going down on-farm, but the off-farm opportunity cost is essentially zero in these instances.
In jobless, spikes in jobless claims like that. So my answer, I think we will see diversification increase on farm. I think that as people kind of move into this world where they wonder about the resiliency of prices, and it's unclear exactly what the best choice is. As that uncertainty kind of feeds through the system, in my mind, that means that people are going to look for more diversification. Specialization is really easy to do when you have some type of kind of long-term plan, and so a good book on at least where my mind or my thought process has been lately is called Range. So it's a pop psychology book. It's really easy to read. It came out last year, but he talks about the kind of struggle with expertise knowledge, where, like, if you become more siloed, to use Phil Tetlock's term, more of a hedgehog, and you just focus on one thing, you become less resilient. And when these wicked problems show up, which is what you could probably call this, you are less likely to be able to kind of pivot. So I think at some level, we're going to see many farms start move toward a more diversified income structure.
I just have to, so I can buy that in terms of the on-farm to off-farm share. I just time thinking about that when we're talking about the ideas of the fact that prices across the board are tanking, and the idea that in agriculture there are these true economies of scale, where you maybe there are economies of scope too, and so there could be some kind of economies of scope that dominate in this instance. But I think my my guess as an economist is that economies of scale is going to drive here, and so
Well,
I can see a scenario in which we become less diversified on farm.
if the argument is that you have like if smaller and medium sized farms are more leveraged and they're more at risk of going out of business, and large farms tend to be more specialized and taking advantage of the economies of scale,
There you
then
go.
there
There's
we
the
are.
story. Yep, and I think that is a huge part of the story.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So I get the stuff that Dawn's talking about there, where she says, as a result of a million years ago, where she had the bar graphs, where she's talking, this one, where she's talking about, well, look at this. We've seen some increased resilience as a result of the existence of what she called the middle class. Forward, I'm not sure benefits of resilience accrue to those that are generating the resilience.
Well, okay, so I'll stay in my lane more than I usually do and talk about beer for a minute. Okay. So on the beer side, so like I said, if you go listen to kind of the Beeronomics webinars, or you try to listen to what's going on there, so taproom sales were kind of the number one driver for growth in the industry of the last few years. And so you have 8,000 breweries in the United States now. When I graduated college, it was less than 2,000. You graduated in the 80s, I think, so it was probably
right.
back. It was like 120 breweries.
Yeah.
So you have this kind of distribution of or this growth in small breweries that are selling tap rooms out of their tap rooms, and those are the guys that are probably the most at risk right now for going out of business and never reopening. And so what I think could happen is maybe the mid-sized players in this case the ones that have access to some distribution channel that's outside of their tap room, they might be able to survive, and we might actually even see a shift in consumer preferences towards those types of packages. Now that's down the supply chain. So if we're talking about corn and soybeans, I have a hard time imagining many of these corn and soybean guys are really going to be looking towards some massively diversified structure.
Well, and we're not talking about middle class in corn and soybeans anyway. But if we're talking about, we've been talking about agriculture throughout. So if we're going to talk about agriculture, then I guess we have to talk about the primary drivers of agriculture.
And we've seen a decrease in mid-sized farms for a long time. So for the smaller farms, I think you're going to keep seeing people pushing toward diversification. And in the larger farms, I think it's just going to keep specializing and automating.
Great.
Fair?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the one that I think you and I disagree on the most is the localized supply chain.
Trey, it's 4:01. Oh. And I just worry that we're going to start throwing things at each other and we won't end until 6 p.m.
Yeah, you're probably right. Let's do 4 minutes on local supply chains or small farms versus large farms.
Okay, go for it, man.
Okay, so my take is that we're going to see this shakeout where supply chains, because we push towards this maximum efficiency, minimizing food waste, and trying to get the cheapest food to the consumer at any cost. I think that there's going to be a shift in the perspective associated with whether or not that's a good thing. And so with that shift, I have this imagination maybe that lets me go toward a place where we start thinking more about diversifying supply chains, which means more of a localized kind of food hub system as opposed to having one national system.
And so I'm the ultimate cynic here, but whether or not this is a good thing isn't the question. It is what will happen given that individuals make these decisions, given that we're seeing the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression, potentially, and we're seeing unemployment rates or jobless rates at 30%. You're not going to see a lot of these people with this willingness to pay for the local. You're going to see people desperate to feed their family and therefore be willing to pay the lowest price possible. Regardless of how good you feel these local hubs are for reality, that's not what's going to be driven by consumer incentives.
Because you think price is going to be the king.
Price is king in an area where
Yes.
where money matters.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point. I also think that like we're experiencing this moment where the underlying trust in the food system is being questioned. You know, it's how many times in the last year has the headline in Bloomberg been food and agriculture? Before this, not very often.
But it's a different
all the time.
conversation. It's a different conversation in that I think we've increasingly vilified the idea of agriculture in the recent past until now we're realizing, oh my gosh, we need this industry. We're desperate for this stuff. And so I don't think it's an awareness of the value of local. To me, it's an awareness of the value of efficiency and stability.
Of agriculture, of supply chains.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fair. I think within the last month, I've thought more about supply chains than I probably thought about supply chains in the last 3 years combined.
Amen, dude. Yeah.
And you know, it has been absolutely amazing to trace all this stuff through. And you know, I'm learning so much so quickly. We're doing our best. How many hours did you sleep last night?
That's not a good indication of anything.
Well, we're working as hard as we can on this, and you know, everybody just keep your head up. You know, this is a crazy times, and if you have any,
hold on, end with the good slide.
Oh yeah, good point. There we go. Well, that's kind of a good slide.
Don't talk about the bad part of it. Just
Okay.
end with the good slide.
Okay, so this is from our World in Data. This is a test per 1,000 people. Look at that spike. So we're actually hopefully seeing this massive increase in tests per 1,000 people. And so the reason why this matters is, in general, the argument is that test and trace is a very, very important step toward maintaining some type of control on COVID-19 while simultaneously opening up the economy. And so that is a very promising signal.
I think that's all the time we got, Trey. Thank you all for listening, and as always, please send us your questions or your comments, or if you just want to yell at us for being stupid, that's great too.
I've gotten a lot of that this week, so please just keep them coming.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep. Thank you.